The Silent Requiem Chapter 1. The Grey Echo. The rain didn't fall. It wasn't that it couldn't fall, not in Stormgard, not in this season. It simply didn't. It was a perpetual fine mist, clinging to the slate-gray stones of the fortress city and coating the perpetually frosted pines that ringed its walls. It was, in essence, the world's most unsettling lullaby, a silence so profound it pressed against the skull. A silence that had claimed everything but the memory of sound. Kalen, bell-ringer of Stormgard, adjusted the worn leather straps of his instrument, a monstrous, intricately carved bronze bell the size of a small ox. It hadn't chimed in 7 years, not since the first tremors of the Stillness began. Now, he practiced endlessly, hammering out a desperate rhythm against the oppressive quiet, a futile attempt to pierce the encroaching void. He was a relic, a ghost in a city choked by apathy, tasked with a duty older than the kingdom itself, a duty to remember what it meant to hear. He wasn't alone. Across the blasted plains, in the icy heart of the Frost-Wolf territory, Orcish Drum-Slayer of the clan Bloodfang wrestled with a war drum crafted from petrified mammoth bone. The drum's resonance was faint, a bruised echo of its former glory, but Orcish was a master, his hands a whirlwind of fury and precision, attempting to draw forth a defiant beat. The other drum slayers had fallen silent, lost to the creeping apathy, but Orcish, driven by a primal inherited rage, fought for every throb. And then, there were the Spire-Elves of Silverwood, a race known for their ethereal connection to the rhythms of the world. Lyra, Harp-Strider of the Silent Cord clan, perched precariously on the highest spire of the Crystal Cathedral, her hands dancing across the strings of a harp woven from moonsilk and starlight. The notes she coaxed were brittle, fractured, mirroring the state of their society. The elven mastery of sound, once capable of shaping the very weather, had become a pale imitation, a desperate clinging to what remained. Tonight, their efforts had coalesced, driven by a shared, unsettling intel. The War of the Stillness, as the Three Kingdoms called it, was no longer a straightforward struggle for resources. It had become a horrifying orchestrated dance of death, meticulously choreographed by the Muted. The Muted, they discovered through a frantic exchange of encrypted messages coded not in words, but in the frantic pulses of their minds, were the architects of the massacre. High-ranking officers, generals, and advisors from each faction, all possessed of shimmering, obsidian-like replacements for their tongues' void silver, harvested from the deepest reaches of the void. These weren't just mutations, they were gateways. The Muted communicated directly with the Hollow King, a being of pure silence, drawing its power from the complete absence of sound. The evidence was chilling. Scout reports, gleaned from intercepted thought waves, detailed how Stormguard's vanguard, under the command of Lord Valerius, had deliberately marched into a designated silence zone, a patch of land where the absence of sound was most intense. Similarly, the Frost-Wolf forces, led by Chieftain Buruk, and the Elven regiments, guided by High Chanter Theron, had followed suit, strategically positioning themselves for annihilation. Kalen, Orcish, and Lyra had met in the neutral territory of the Echo Well's ancient sites, guarded by the remnants of the old magic, where pockets of sound stubbornly persisted. These wells were the last bastions of hope, and the Muted clearly understood their strategic significance. They were actively dismantling them, stripping them of their resonance. Tonight's reconnaissance, orchestrated by a grizzled, blind veteran named Silas, a man who clung to the memory of sound with a desperate ferocity, revealed the horrifying truth. The Muted weren't simply leading their armies to their deaths. They were feeding the Hollow King. The silence zones weren't just areas of absence, they were miniature harvest fields, meticulously cultivated for their destructive potential. "They're using us?" Lyra hissed, her voice strained, barely audible above the drumming of her own heartbeat. "They're deliberately driving us into these zones, absorbing our echoes, strengthening the king. Rockstone slammed his drum into the ground, a guttural roar tearing from his throat, less a sound, more vibrational protest that rattled the very foundations of the cavern. The betrayal burns deeper than the ice. Valerius, Theron, they used to be brothers, cousins even. Why would they? Kalen, his hands trembling, struck the bell. The note was weak, hesitant, but it carried a desperate plea. We have to understand. How can leaders choose to willingly march to their destruction? As he spoke, a new tremor ran through the air, a cold, invasive wave of silence, deeper and more unsettling than before. The air thickened, heavy, with an unnatural stillness, and then a single, shimmering form coalesced before them, the Hollow King. Not a monster of flesh and bone, but a void, a swirling vortex of absolute silence, radiating an aura of cold, empty power. Its presence was a physical assault, draining the very will to think, to feel, to hear. You are curious, a voice echoed in their minds, not through their ears, but directly into their thoughts. It was the Hollow King, a thought voice crafted from nothingness. You seek to understand, but understanding, like sound, is a dangerous thing. Chapter 2. The Architect of Stillness. The Hollow King's presence intensified, a suffocating blanket of nothingness that pressed against their minds. Lyra, the bell ringer of Stormgard, felt a disconcerting blankness creeping into her memories, like a film of frost slowly erasing the details of her past. Grockstone, the Drum-Slayer of the Frost-Wolf Orcs, gripped his massive war drum tighter, the rhythmic hammering a desperate attempt to anchor himself to reality. Kalen, the Harp-Strider of the Spire-Elves, frantically adjusted the delicate strings of his harp, searching for a resonance, a counterpoint to the king's oppressive silence. It sits feeding on our thoughts, Kalen finally managed, his voice a strained whisper. The way he speaks, it isn't a voice in the air. It's extracted, like his siphoning our memories, our emotions, directly from our minds. The king shifted, a slow, unsettling rotation of void black energy. Images flickered momentarily in their minds, glimpses of Stormguard's battlefields, choked with silent gray soldiers, the chilling, vacant stare of Valerius, the Stormguard bishop, leading his men into a swirling silence, zoned the rhythmic, terrifying beat of Grockstone's drum, amplified and corrupted. As an architect, Lyra realized, her mind struggling against the encroaching void, not just of destruction, but of stillness. He's meticulously designed this war, orchestrated every move. The silence zones stay aren't accidental. They're meticulously crafted traps. Grockstone, regaining some of his typically ferocious bearing, slammed his drum again, a furious cascade of vibrations that echoed through the cavern. Then we break the pattern. We shatter his design. Driven by this desperate instinct, they began to experiment, using their instruments not as weapons, but as instruments of disruption. Lyra, recalling the ancient techniques taught by her elders, focused on creating a complex, layered melody, drawing upon the rhythms of the ocean, the whispers of the wind, the heartbeat of the earth, anything to generate a competing vibration. The bell, usually a beacon of clarity, produced a fractured, dissonant chime, a chaotic ripple in the king's suffocating silence. Kalen's harp, guided by instinct and a desperate hope, began to weave a song of unmaking, a melody derived from the forgotten language of the Spire-Elves, a song said to unravel the very fabric of men. The notes were initially weak, barely perceptible, but as he poured more of himself into the music, the vibrations intensified, creating a shimmering distortion around the king. It was like trying to hold back a raging river with a single fragile reed. The Hollow King responded, not with violence, but with a chilling logic. Your efforts are amusing, the thought voice echoed, laced with a detached amusement. You believe you are disrupting a design? You are merely reinforcing its foundations. Your sounds are not dissonant. They are perfect components in a symphony of annihilation. Each vibration strengthens my grasp, fuels my expansion. Suddenly, a horrifying realization dawned on them. The king wasn't simply absorbing their sounds, he was interpreting them, twisting them into weapons against himself. The chaotic clashing of Lyra's bells wasn't a disruption, it was bolstering the king's ability to unravel the intricate defenses of Stormgard. Kaelin's weaving song wasn't dismantling magic, it was accelerating the king's ability to corrupt the very essence of elven magic. And Grokstone's rhythmic drumming, meant to shatter the king, was actually reinforcing his control over the earth itself. "We're not fighting him," Grokstone roared, his face contorted with fury and despair. "We're feeding him. Our greatest strengths are becoming his most potent weapons." As he shouted, a ghostly image materialized within the king's vortex. Valerius, the Stormgard bishop, standing before the king, his void silver tongue gleaming with an unnatural light. Valerius wasn't a prisoner, he was a conduit, actively channeling his power into the king's being. Then, a chilling understanding struck Lyra. The muted weren't simply traitors. They were instruments, deliberately designed to fulfill this horrifying purpose. "It's not just about the silence," she gasped, clutching her bell. "It's about control. They're controlling us, manipulating our abilities, turning us into weapons against ourselves." With renewed, desperate resolve, Lyra began to pound her bell with a furious, erratic rhythm, not a carefully crafted melody, but a raw, primal scream of defiance, a chaotic torrent of vibrations designed to overload the king's senses. Kaelin and Grokstone followed suit, intensifying their efforts, creating a cacophony of discordant sounds that threatened to unravel the very fabric of the cavern. The hollow king writhed, the vortex of silence flickering violently. The images in their minds intensified: the silent armies, the corrupted leaders, the horrifying truth of their manipulation. And then, a single thought, clear and resonant, broke through the king's oppressive influence. Resistance is inefficient. Chapter 3. The Resonance of Defiance. The air in the great resonance cathedral pulsed with a sickening stillness, a vacuum of sound, so profound it seemed to press against their eardrums, amplifying the frantic rhythm of Lyra's bell. The cathedral itself, a monument to the world's original music, was now a tomb of silence, its towering pillars carved with intricate reliefs depicting the joyous sounds of creation: hunting horns, choral hymns, the crash of a waterfall, all frozen in a perpetual, agonizing quiet. Valerius, the bishop, remained a chilling spectacle, his void silver tongue a polished obsidian mirror reflecting the chaotic energy swirling around him. His eyes, once pools of fervent faith, were now vacant black wells, radiating an unnerving intelligent cold. He didn't flinch, didn't even seem to register the escalating assault of sound, lost entirely within the king's network. "He's drawing energy from us," Kaelin growled, slamming his war drum with a ferocity that threatened to shatter the ancient height. The drum's deep tones, normally a precise measured beat that could shatter stone, were now a frantic, desperate pulse, attempting to wrestle control from the bishop. Every beat, every pulsate fueling the silence. Grokstone, usually a stoic giant, was a whirlwind of primal energy. His war drums, crafted from the bone of extinct leviathans, vibrated with the raw, untamed heartbeat of the planet. He wasn't playing a rhythm, he was channeling a geological force, the tectonic shift of millennia, attempting to overwhelm the insidious influence of the Hollow King. Sweat plastered his dark braids to his chest, and his muscles strained with the sheer effort of disrupting the Void Silver's insidious connection. The tremors. Lyra gasped, her voice strained. They're not just echoing the drums. They're responding. The earth itself is fighting back. The vortex around Valerius pulsed brighter, the silence within it deepening, becoming almost tangible. Suddenly, a wave of images slammed into their minds, overwhelming and horrific. Not just the silent armies marching into the silence zones, but the design of the muted, the meticulous engineering of their corrupted tongues. The intricate network of void silver connecting them all to the Hollow King. They saw the schematics, cold and clinical, outlining how the mute's amplified vibrations would precisely shape the environment, concentrating the king's power. It's a feedback loop, Lyra screamed, her bell's rhythm shifting into a complex, almost mathematical pattern, attempting to disrupt the flow of energy. They're not just being controlled, they're designed to control us. Galen, drawing on the strength of the Frost-Wolf Orcs, shifted his technique. Instead of raw force, he began to weave a complex counter-rhythm, a fractal of layered beats that seemed to unravel the king's control over the muted. He focused not on destruction, but on disruption, on injecting chaos into the perfectly ordered night. Grockstone, recognizing the shift, amplified his drumming, adding a deep resonant pulse that bypassed the intricate network of the void silver. The cathedral itself seemed to respond, the ancient stone vibrating with a low guttural hum, a primal roar of resistance. Then, a chilling realization dawned on them. They weren't just battling the king, they were battling the idea of control. The Hollow King's influence wasn't just about stealing sound, it was about stealing agency, about reducing everything to a state of passive obedience. "We're fighting a ghost," Lyra shouted, her voice laced with desperate clarity. "A ghost built on silence." Suddenly, Valerius moved. Not with a conscious action, but with a subtle shift, a barely perceptible intensification of the humming within his void silver tongue. The vortex around him flared, bathing the chamber in an unbearable white light. "Resistance's inefficient," the king's thought echoed, amplified by the bishop's corrupted mind, aimed not at them, but at himself. A terrifying alien logic, cold and devoid of emotion, momentarily seized Valerius. He began to sing, not a hymn of devotion, but a discordant, unsettling drone, amplifying the king's presence, feeding his power. But something had changed. The chaos they had unleashed, the relentless assault of sound, had created a resonance, a feedback loop. Lyra, recognizing the shift in the king's thought pattern, adjusted her bell's rhythm with a desperate precision, focusing not on combat, but on counter-resonance. She began to imitate the bishop's drone, but with a subtly altered frequency, a discordant note within the king's own unsettling harmony. Kalen and Grockstone followed suit, their drums and Leviathan bone responding in kind, creating a complex layered tapestry of sound that fought to dismantle the king's control. As the three rhythms intertwined, a visible distortion rippled through the void silver in Valerius' tongue. The unnatural light flickered, sputtered, and then, with a final agonizing crackle, the tongue shattered. Not with a violent explosion, but with a delicate, almost mournful disintegration, like the breaking of a frozen tear. The telepathic link severed, the bishop collapsed to his knees, a broken, bewildered figure. The vortex around the king diminished, its suffocating silence beginning to unravel. Chapter 4. The Coup of the Crescendo. The silence in the great resonance cathedral, already a suffocating blanket, pulsed with a frantic energy. Valerius, stripped of his insidious connection, thrashed on the marble floor, a whirlwind of corrupted thought and desperate voiceless commands. The air crackled with residual magic, the shattered void silver fragments shimmering like captured starlight. His eyes, once glittering with unsettling calculation, were now wide with a primal terror, reflecting the blossoming chaos around him. "Silence must be maintained," he rasped, the words a fractured echo of his original intent, a pathetic struggle against the tide of restored sound. Lyra, Kalen, and Grockstone, continued their intricate dance of counter-resonance. Lyra's bell, crafted from solidified moonstone and resonating with the ancient rhythms of Stormgard, pulsed with a steady, unwavering brilliance. She wasn't aiming for a single, overwhelming attack. She understood now that the Hollow King wasn't simply listening. It was feeding on their fear, their confusion, their very attempts to combat it. The key was disruption, a constant, irritating dissonance that forced the king to expend energy, to actively maintain his control. Kalen, the Drum-Slayer of the Frost-Wolf Orcs, was a force of raw, visceral power. He slammed his war drum, a monstrous beast carved from the heartwood of a petrified ice giant, with a relentless, driving beat. It wasn't a rhythmic war march, but a churning primal pulse, mirroring the slow geological heartbeat of the mountains beneath them. The sound hammered against the collapsing void silver, each strike a miniature earthquake of sonic force. His face was contorted in a mask of fierce concentration, his knuckles white as he fought to channel the deep, resonant fury of his people. Rockstone, the Leviathan bone harper, added a layer of unsettling complexity. He wielded a colossal harp, crafted from the bones of a long-dead deep-sea leviathan, its strings made of polished obsidian. Unlike the sharp, aggressive rhythms of Kalen's drums and Lyra's bells, Rockstone's music was ancient, haunting, a lament for forgotten civilizations and the slow erosion of time. He wasn't trying to destroy, he was trying to unravel the carefully constructed patterns of the king's influence. The obsidian strings resonated with the king's own corrupted frequencies, subtly shifting them, introducing tiny, almost imperceptible variations that chipped away at the foundations of his control. As the three rhythms intertwined, the distortion around the king grew more pronounced. The air shimmered, not just with the fractured light of the shattered void silver, but with a visible wave of unraveling energy. The very walls of the cathedral seemed to vibrate, ancient runes etched into the stone, glowing with an intensified luminescence. Suddenly, a new voice, sharp and clear, cut through the burgeoning cacophony. Bishop Morian, the second of the corrupted leaders, his own void silver tongue now a twisted, grotesque parody of flesh. He was attempting a desperate, panicked counterattack, attempting to force a new, even more potent connection with the king. Silence! Obey! The echo wells are not gifts, they are conduits. You are parasites, feeding on the silence, corrupting the source. His voice, though fractured and strained, held a chilling conviction. Lyra recognized the tactic immediately. The bishop wasn't trying to attack them directly, he was trying to incite panic, to reignite the cycle of fear and despair that fueled the king's power. With a decisive movement, she shifted the rhythm of her bell, introducing a complex, layered counter-phrase, a mournful lament, woven with the echoes of Stormgard's lost song. It was a deliberate act of empathy, acknowledging the bishop's terror, but framing it as a weakness to be exploited. Kalen responded with a deafening guttural roar, a primal challenge to the bishop's attempted manipulation. The sound resonated through the cathedral, shaking the very foundations. Rockstone's harp began to weave a new melody, a rising crescendo of interwoven tones, a desperate plea for order, for understanding, for a return to the harmonious balance that had been lost. The combined effect was overwhelming. The void silver in Morian's tongue began to vibrate violently, the unnatural light intensifying to an unbearable brilliance. The bishop screamed not with a telepathic command, but with a raw, agonizing burst of pain, a physical manifestation of the dissonance tearing through his corrupted flesh. Then, with a delicate, almost mournful disintegration, the tongue shattered. Not with a violent explosion, but with a delicate, almost mournful disintegration, like the breaking of a frozen tear. The telepathic link severed, the bishop collapsed to his knees, a broken, bewildered figure. As the final vestiges of the bishop's corrupted influence dissipated, the vortex around the king shuddered violently. The suffocating silence began to unravel, replaced first by a faint hum, then a murmur, then, finally, a resonant thrum that vibrated through their very bones. Chapter 5. The Fractured Choir. The immediate aftermath of Maureen's disintegration was a jarring, almost physically painful silence. The cathedral, previously a cavern of barely contained dread, was now a vacuum, pregnant with the potential for sound. Rockstone, ever attuned to the earth's heartbeat, was the first to react. He slammed his war harp against the massive stone floor, a single, sustained chord that blossomed outwards, a tentative note against the vast emptiness. This time, it wasn't a desperate plea, it was a declaration. "We listen," he boomed, his voice echoing with an unexpected clarity, a sound that hadn't graced the cathedral in decades. "We hear." Kalen, still radiating raw fury, joined in. He wasn't attempting melodies, but a series of controlled roars, each a carefully calibrated assault on the residual void energy clinging to the fallen bishop. He recognized with a chilling understanding that the Hollow King wasn't merely stealing sound, it was consuming intent, emotion, will. His roars were designed to disrupt this insidious process, to force the king to acknowledge the primal force of resistance. The effect was immediate. The hum Grockstone had initiated intensified, growing into a palpable vibration. Cracks spiderwebbed across the cathedral's walls, not from destructive force, but from the strain of the sound attempting to mend the shattered harmonic pattern. Figures, Stormgard knights, Frost-Wolf warriors, Spire-Elves huddled together, initially paralyzed by the intensity, then slowly, tentatively, beginning to mimic the sounds. A tentative drum beat from a Stormgard veteran, a hesitant strum from a young elven apprentice, a low rumble from a Frost-Wolf chieftain. It was chaotic, beautiful, and terrifying. The air itself seemed to shimmer, as if struggling to contain the unleashed energy. They were building a fractured choir, a chorus of defiance orchestrated by the three unlikely heroes. However, the Hollow King wasn't yielding easily. Around the collapsing vortex where the king had manifested, a creeping grayness intensified, solidifying into a shimmering, obsidian-like surface. It wasn't a shield. Exactly, it was a filter, actively dampening the restored sound, attempting to re-establish its dominion of silence. "It's feeding on our effort." "Ilara, the bell ringer!" shouted, her voice surprisingly strong amidst the growing symphony. "The more we hear, the stronger it gets. The traitorous frequencies are amplifying it." She frantically adjusted the tuning of her chimes, shifting the resonant frequencies, attempting to find a counter-frequency to disrupt the king's control. The chimes produced a cascade of light, beautiful but unstable, throwing dancing patterns across the cathedral floor, momentarily pushing back the grayish haze. The breakthrough, however, came from an unexpected source, the echoes of the mutid's own actions. Analyzing the pattern of their manipulation, Kalen realized that the void silver tongues weren't just conduits, they were resonators. The muted had deliberately shaped their telepathic commands, creating a specific, unsettling harmonic structure that fed the Hollow King. "They weren't transmitting orders," Kalen growled, his voice strained. "They were singing it to sleep." He turned to Grockstone, grasping a new concept. "We need to shatter the song. We need to introduce a dissonance so profound it overwhelms the king's ability to process it." With a decisive movement, Grockstone abandoned his melodic harp playing. Instead, he began to play a single dissonant chord, a jarring clash of tones that seemed to defy the very laws of harmony. It was a sound born of grief, of profound loss, a deliberate act of sonic ugliness. The effect was immediate and brutal. The gray surface around the vortex pulsed violently, throwing out shards of obsidian. The grayness recoiled, then surged forward, attempting to smother the dissonant chord. But it couldn't hold. The king's influence was unraveling, not with a dramatic explosion, but with the slow, agonizing collapse of a perfectly constructed structure. As the last of the mute's corrupted influence dissipated, a single perfect note rang out from Ilaris' chimes, a pure, resonant tone that seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality. It wasn't a joyful sound, it was a note of finality, of irrevocable severance. The vortex imploded, not with a cataclysmic release, but with a contained shimmering collapse, leaving behind only a swirling mist of silver dust. Silence descended, not the oppressive silence of the Hollow King's dominion, but a profound, almost holy quiet. Then slowly, tentatively, the symphony began to rebuild itself, stronger and more resilient than before. The three kingdoms had begun to sing, not in unison, but in a complex, vibrant tapestry of sound, a testament to the enduring power of connection and the terrifying beauty of a restored world. Chapter 6. The Echoes of Reconciliation. The immediate aftermath of the coup of the crescendo was disorienting. The great Resonance Cathedral, once a monument to the Hollow King's silent dominion, now thrummed with a chaotic, nascent symphony. The silver dust, finer than powdered bone, settled like a shimmering snow, coating everything in a delicate, melancholic sheen. The air itself felt thick with potential, vibrating with 1,000 nascent harmonies. For the first few hours, there was only the rebuilding. Grockstone, his harp still cradled in his arms, felt a profound sense of unease. He wasn't a warrior, not truly. His grief, a cold, gnawing emptiness, demanded expression, not action. Elara, her chimes silent now, moved with a strange, almost ritualistic grace, meticulously collecting the silver dust and carefully depositing it into a series of intricately carved basins. Kalen, the Drum-Slayer, remained by the central vortex, now a swirling, opalescent pool, his massive war drums silent, yet radiating a palpable tension. "It's unsettling," he rumbled, his voice a low vibration, deeper than any sound had ever made before. "The silence, it's not gone. It's layered, like a memory, clinging to the edges of this new sound." The three kingdoms, represented by a hastily assembled council within the cathedral, were a study in cautious observation. Human representatives, primarily Bishop Marius, a grizzled veteran stripped of his ceremonial robes, and Lord Valerius, a pragmatic strategist who'd seen too much war, regarded the swirling energy with a wary respect. The Frost-Wolf Orcs, led by the formidable chieftain Baruch Stonehand, and the Spire-Elves, represented by the serene and ancient Lyra, were even more reserved. Centuries of ingrained distrust and generations of warring had forged an unbreakable shell around their cautious natures. It was during this tense observation that the first genuine attempts at communication began. Not the forced telepathic intrusions of the muted, but hesitant, physical exchanges. Valerius, surprisingly, was the first to break the ice. He offered a simple, carefully worded proposition: "We need to understand this resonance. We need to learn to control it. Perhaps together." Baruch, after a prolonged guttural grunt that translated to something akin to cautious acceptance, responded, "The earth remembers. The drums still hold the pulse. We can feel the flow. But it is foreign, like a song sung in a language we do not understand." Lyra, her movements fluid and deliberate, added, "The music of the veil is ancient. It speaks of balance, of harmony. But it is a delicate instrument. Improper use could shatter it completely." The true breakthrough, however, came unexpectedly. A young human boy, Rice, a bell ringer from Stormgard, had wandered away from the council, drawn by the shimmering dust. He was instinctively drawn to a small, fractured piece of the void silver that had clung to one of the pillars. As he tentatively touched it, a faint, almost imperceptible chime resonated from his bell, a single pure tone, unlike anything he'd ever heard before. He looked up, startled, his eyes wide with confusion. I heard it, he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. A little sound. Suddenly, Kalen stepped forward, his massive frame radiating a focused energy. He instinctively began to tap a complex rhythm on his drums, a slow, deliberate pulse that mirrored the boy's hesitant chime. As the two sounds intertwined, a cascade of color erupted from the vortex, swirling and intensifying. The silver dust shimmered brighter, the air grew warmer, and for the first time since the Hollow King's dominion began, a tangible sense of hope filled the cathedral. Elara, observing the exchange, began to manipulate her chimes, responding to Kalen's rhythm with a series of intricate harmonies. The effect was immediate and astonishing. The other members of the council, initially hesitant, began to instinctively mimic the sounds, a bishop softly ringing a small bell, a Frost-Wolf Orc banging a rhythm on a stone, an elven scribe producing a delicate, resonant tone with a piece of crystal. Slowly, tentatively, a symphony began to build, not a coordinated masterpiece, but a chaotic, beautiful mess of sound. It was rough, fractured, and undeniably unsettling, yet it was undeniably real. The echoes of the silence were fading, replaced by the burgeoning promise of a world restored. As the crescendo reached a fever pitch, a figure emerged from the swirling mist, not the Hollow King, but a being of pure, iridescent light. It was a guardian of the veil, a remnant of an ancient order tasked with protecting the balance between sound and silence. It spoke, not with words, but with a torrent of pure sonic energy, a complex tapestry of harmonies, rhythms, and tones that resonated directly within the minds of the council. The wound is healing, the guardian communicated, but the scars remain. The path forward requires vigilance, understanding, and above all, respect for the delicate balance of the echoes. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving behind a single perfectly formed echo, a note of warning, and a promise of continued guidance. The symphony, now richer and more vibrant than ever before, swelled, a testament to the unlikely alliance forged in the heart of a silent kingdom. The War of the Stillness had, perhaps, begun to find its true requiem, not a lament for what was lost, but a celebration of what could be. Chapter 7. The resonance of remembrance, the immediate aftermath of the coup of the crescendo, was a disorientation of profound sensory overload. For weeks, the three nations had existed in a state of brutal, muted conflict, their armies operating on instinct and suspicion. Now, the world was a torrent, the chirping of crickets in the newly verdant plains of Stormgard, the deep thrum of the earth beneath the Frost-Wolf Mountains, the intricate, layered harmonies emanating from the Spire-Elves' shimmering city. It was almost unbearable, yet King Theron, the Frost-Wolf chieftain, initially bristled at the sudden, insistent drumming of the human bell-ringers, Lyra and Kalen. He had grown accustomed to the cold logic of tactical commands delivered in terse grunts and the rhythmic beat of his war drums. The chaotic, joyous clang of the bells threatened to unravel his command, to shatter the carefully cultivated discipline of his warriors. But the visceral reaction of the orcs, their faces etched with a sensation they hadn't experienced in generations, feeling compelled him to cautiously observe. Similarly, High Elder Sylvana of the Spire-Elves wrestled with the sudden influx of emotional resonance. For centuries, her people had mastered the art of manipulating sound for defense, for healing, for weaving illusions. Their society was built on a meticulous understanding of tonal shifts and harmonic balances. But this wasn't controlled. This was raw, unfiltered experience. Many of the younger elves wept, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of shared joy and grief emanating from the restored echo wells. Kalen, the bell ringer, found himself surprisingly drawn to the rhythmic complexity of the Orcish drums. Had spent his life focusing on the precise, clear tones of his bells, instruments of defense and warning. But Grok's drumming wasn't about clarity, it was about primal force, about connecting with the heartbeat of the world. He began to tentatively incorporate rhythmic patterns into his bell ringing, a chaotic but ultimately exhilarating collaboration with the Drum-Slayer. The Human Council, led by the pragmatic and increasingly intuitive Lord Cassian, was the most rapidly adapting. Cassian, a veteran of countless battles, recognized the potential of this restored sound. He dispatched teams to survey the silent zones, now pulsating with nascent life. They discovered not just barren wastelands, but pockets of extraordinary biodiversity, plants and creatures evolving at an accelerated rate, fueled by the reawakened vibrations of life. The Hollow King didn't just steal sound, Cassian announced to the council, his voice clear and strong, a rare commodity in their silent era. He stole growth. He stunted evolution. These zones, they are brimming with potential. However, the unsettling truth lingered. The Guardian's warning the scars remain was proving to be more than a philosophical sentiment. Strange, dissonant echoes began to appear within the symphony, distortions of the restored sounds. In Stormgard, the familiar calls of the hunting falcons were replaced by whispers of despair. In the Spire-Elves city, the gentle cascading of water from the crystal fountains morphed into unsettling, grinding noises. In the Frost-Wolf Mountains, the rhythmic pulse of the earth pulsed with an undercurrent of something wrong. Then a single voice, clear and resonant, cut through the symphony, a voice that wasn't generated by sound, but seemed to exist within the silence. It came from the great resonance cathedral, now radiating a warmth that hadn't been there before. "The echoes are reacting," the voice announced, belonging to Master Ilara, the Elder Harp-Strider. "The loyalties of the muted, though shattered, are not entirely gone. They are attempting to reassert control, to manipulate the returning symphony to their advantage." A scouting party led by Kaelin, Lyra, and Grok investigated. They found that the muted remnants of the traitorous factions weren't actively attacking. Instead, they were subtly altering the symphony, introducing discordant notes, amplifying areas of fear and uncertainty. They hadn't abandoned their telepathic communication, instead leveraging it to subtly influence the emotions of the returning warriors, sowing doubt and mistrust. "They're not trying to destroy the symphony," Lyra realized, her fingers instinctively shaping a counter-rhythm on her bells. "They're trying to rewrite it." The symphony, it seemed, was no longer a simple restoration. It was a battleground, a struggle for the very soul of the world, fought not with swords and shields, but with the delicate weapon of sound. The silent Requiem had just begun its second act. Chapter 8. The Chorus of Discord. The air in the great resonance cathedral thrummed with a nervous energy. The newly solidified stone walls, infused with the nascent symphony, pulsed with a gentle light, a visual echo of the returning sound. Master Ilara, her silver hair braided with shimmering strands of captured resonance, stood at the central dais, her Harp-Strider's instrument vibrating with a complex, unsettling melody. "Their influence is stronger than we anticipated," she stated, her voice unusually strained. "They've established a nexus within the cathedral's core, utilizing the residual magic of the void silver to amplify their insidious whispers. We've identified 3 key nodes: the southern archway, the western altar, and the chamber beneath the main resonance chamber." Kaelin, the human bell ringer, adjusted the intricate mechanism of his chime armor. The plates of polished steel, keyed to resonate with specific frequencies, shimmered with a protective aura. "We need to isolate these nodes. Disruption alone won't suffice." The muted errant, aiming for brute force, they're crafting a lullaby of chaos. "Rock!" the Orcish Drum-Slayer grunted, hefting his war drum, not the traditional booming instrument of his people, but a meticulously crafted piece of obsidian and bone, tuned to the planet's core rhythms. "They use silence to make you feel the silence. Makes you question your own strength, your own purpose." He tapped, a slow, deliberate beat. The vibrations felt deep within the floor, a subtle tremor of unease. We need a counterpulse. Something solid, something real. Lyra, ever the pragmatic strategist, was meticulously tracing pathways with a small handheld resonator, mapping the flow of corrupted sound. Their network isn't just telepathic, she said, her voice tight with concentration. They're layering it with harmonics, subtle shifts in the returning resonance that trigger specific emotional responses. Fear, doubt, it's exquisitely crafted. As they moved to investigate the southern archway, the cathedral began to subtly shift. The light dimmed, replaced by a gray static that clung to the edges of their vision. The air grew heavy, thick with a prickling sensation of isolation. Then, a voice not spoken, but felt brushed against their minds, cold and calculate. "Leave this place, bell ringer. The symphony is a fragile thing. You threatened to break it." It was Bishop Marius, once a staunch advocate of Stormguard's military might, now a hollow shell of void silver. His eyes, devoid of pupils, glowed with an unnatural purple light. Behind him, 3 Stormguard soldiers, their armor similarly corrupted, raised their swords. Kalen reacted instantly, unleashing a torrent of carefully modulated chimes that slammed against the soldiers' armor, disrupting their movements. The disruption was effective, but Marius' influence remained, a tightening coil of dread around the heart of the cathedral. "You misunderstand," Marius continued, his voice a ghostly echo. "The symphony is not meant to be heard. It is meant to be controlled. Imagine the power, a world orchestrated by thought, by will." Grok, sensing the shift, let loose a barrage of percussive blasts from his drum. The vibrations weren't intended to harm, but to overwhelm. The raw, primal rhythm pulsed outwards, attempting to shatter the psychic hold Marius was exerting. The effect was chaotic, and briefly successful, momentarily disrupting Marius' control, but the archway pulsed with a stronger wave of gray static. Meanwhile, Lyra discovered the source of the corrupted harmonics at the western altar. An elven scholar, Sylvanus, had been subtly altering the cathedral's resonance pathways, weaving, in discordant notes of loss and regret, echoes of ancient elven defeats, amplified and weaponized. "He's feeding on the sorrow of our ancestors," she muttered, expertly countertuning her bells, attempting to neutralize the elven influence. But Sylvanus' magic was potent, insidious. The vibrations of her bells created a jarring, unsettling response, and a vision flashed through her mind, a battlefield littered with the broken bodies of her ancestors. "We must break his focus," Kalen shouted, realizing the strategic implications. "Grok, can you overload his resonant frequency?" Grok nodded, channeling the core rhythms of the mountain with a ferocity that shook the entire cathedral. The obsidian and bone drum responded with a deafening roar, a concentrated blast of sonic energy aimed directly at Sylvanus. The effect was devastating, not physically, but neurologically. Sylvanus collapsed, clutching his head, overwhelmed by a cacophony of raw, primal sound. The final node, beneath the main chamber, proved to be the most challenging. Here, the muted were attempting to manipulate the very structure of the resonance, seeking to collapse it entirely, returning the world to the suffocating silence of the Hollow King's domain. It was a battle not of sound, but of fundamental vibration. The fate of the world rested on their ability to restore the symphony before it was irrevocably silenced. Chapter 9. The Heartbeat of Stone. The air in the great resonance cathedral throbbed with a desperate, fractured rhythm. The stone itself seemed to groan under the assault, ancient glyphs etched into its surface pulsing with an unnatural, sickly green light, the color of the Hollow King's influence. Kalen, his face slick with sweat and dusted with pulverized stone, wrestled with the control pillar, a colossal obsidian obelisk humming with chaotic energy. The mutid's magic wasn't simply disrupting the cathedral, they were actively trying to unmake it, to unravel the very fabric of sound that bound reality together. "It's a lattice of negation." Grok bellowed, slamming his war drum against the pillar's base. The sound wasn't a blast, but a sustained, agonizing drone, a counterpulse to the mutants' efforts. They're trying to sever the connection between the echo wells and the world. If they succeed, the silence will spread like a frost, consuming everything. Sylvanus, though still weakened, lay on a makeshift pallet of polished granite, his head wrapped in a cowl woven with silver thread. He was a ravaged landscape of violet veins and flickering shadows, his eyes radiating a tormented intelligence. The drum's assault had not killed him, but it had irrevocably altered his perception, leaving him trapped in an endless, overwhelming symphony. He fought against it, attempting to conjure a single pure note of silence, but the echoes of his own despair, amplified by the cathedral, crashed over him like a tidal wave. "The muted are drawing on the ghosts of the cataclysm," Holler observed, her voice tight with grim understanding. "They're not just manipulating sound, they're pulling forth the trauma of this place, feeding it into the void." She continued her meticulous work, carefully adjusting the tuning of her bells. Their goal isn't to silence the world, but to corrupt it with the memory of silence. Kalen, a veteran of 100 battles, felt a chilling realization dawn. The muted weren't simply betrayers, they were orchestrating an elaborate form of psychic torture, a deliberate assault on the very soul of the cathedral and, by extension, the world. He pushed himself harder, channeling the rhythmic thrumming of his own heartbeat, a primal beat of human resilience through the control pillar. He visualized the echo wells, drawing energy from them like a lifeline, and focused on amplifying that flow, building a counter-resonance. "We need to disrupt their connection to the spectral realm," he yelled. "Grok, increase the intensity. Let's drown them in the heartbeat of the stone." Grok, fueled by adrenaline and a fierce loyalty to Kalen, responded with a terrifying surge of power. The obsidian drum began to vibrate with an almost unbearable force, the sound resonating not just through the stone, but through the very bones of the cathedral, causing fissures to spiderweb across the walls. The mutes' attempts to solidify their lattice of negation faltered, the green light flickering and dying. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. Bishop Morian, one of the most influential of the muted, his void silver tongue gleaming unnaturally in the fractured light. He wasn't physically fighting, but projecting a wave of pure, chilling silence. It slammed into Kalen, stealing his breath, making his muscles seize. He staggered, fighting to maintain his focus. "You cannot understand." Morian's voice echoed within Kalen's mind, devoid of inflection, a chillingly precise thought delivered directly into his consciousness. The sound, it is a lie. A frantic, desperate attempt to cling to a dying world. True peace lies in stillness. Just as Kalen was about to succumb to the encroaching silence, Holler intervened. With a desperate, almost frantic movement, she struck her largest bell, unleashing a chord of unparalleled complexity, a cascade of layered harmonies that fought against Morian's psychic assault. The sound, born of ancient elven magic and a profound understanding of the natural world, resonated with a raw, untamed beauty. "This isn't about peace, Morian," Holler cried, her voice ringing with righteous fury. "It's about control. About silencing those who dare to feel." The effect was immediate. Morian's mental projection wavered, disrupted by the sheer force of Holler's sonic attack. He cried out, a silent scream that tore through the cathedral and collapsed to the floor, his void silver tongue flickering and dissolving into ash. With Morian neutralized, Grok unleashed a final, earth-shattering blast from the drum. The vibrations were so intense, so primal, that even the walls of the cathedral trembled. The muted's remaining efforts to control the resonance shattered completely, and the cathedral responded with a surge of revitalized energy, a triumphant crescendo of sound that pushed back the encroaching silence. As the last vestiges of the muted's influence faded, the true nature of their plan became terrifyingly clear. The Hollow King wasn't merely harvesting sound, he was absorbing the potential for sound, slowly extinguishing the capacity for life itself. The silence wasn't just a physical phenomenon, it was a metaphysical void, and they had been unknowingly feeding it. Chapter 10, The Echo of Betrayal. The air in the great resonance cathedral still thrummed. A chaotic, glorious pulse born of shattered silver and redirected intent. Dust motes danced in the shafts of dawnlight filtering through the stained glass windows, now depicting not scenes of heroic battles, but swirling patterns of sound, fragmented melodies, roaring winds, the quiet murmur of a stream. The stench of dissolved void silver, acrid and metallic, mingled with the ozone tang of unleashed magic. Holler, the bell ringer, stood amidst the wreckage, her face streaked with grime and exhaustion, but her eyes blazing with an almost unnerving intensity. Her hands, raw and stinging from channeling the raw energy of the ancient bells, moved instinctively, shaping smaller, more focused chords, attempting to soothe the cathedral's frantic heartbeat. Grok, the Drum-Slayer, remained hunched over his immense war drum, its polished hide still vibrating with a residual energy that made the very stone beneath his feet hum. He meticulously cleaned the drum with a scrap of linen, a solemn ritual performed with a reverence usually reserved for ancient gods. Across the vast chamber, Elara, the Harp-Strider, carefully plucked at the strings of her silverwood harp, weaving a counterpoint to Holler's more forceful chords. Her movements were precise, elegant, imbued with the ancient knowledge of the Spire-Elves, a knowledge that revealed the true depth of the Mute's deception. The vibrations? They're not just resisting the Hollow King, Elara said, her voice hushed, almost reverent. They're fighting him. The muted weren't attempting to manipulate the resonance, they were attempting to stabilize it, to create a predictable, controllable pattern for the Hollow King to feed upon. Rock grunted, pausing his cleaning. That's madness. Why would they want to make it easier for the empty thing? Because they weren't interested in restoring sound, Holler countered, her voice gaining strength. They were interested in control. They saw the potential for the Hollow King's influence, the potential for a perfectly silent world, and they were willing to sacrifice everything, every vestige of life to achieve it. The revelation hung heavy in the air. The realization that the Mute's actions hadn't been born of misguided ambition, but of calculated, chilling nihilism, was a far more terrifying prospect. It shifted the focus from a simple battle against a parasitic entity to a war against a corrupted ideology. Suddenly, a faint tremor ran through the cathedral. Not a physical tremor, but a disturbance in the restored resonance, a discordant note like a broken chord. A small, shimmering ripple appeared in the air near the shattered remains of Bishop Theron's void silver tongue. And a voice, utterly devoid of warmth or inflection, echoed through the chamber. Interesting. Your efforts are stimulating. The voice was undeniably the Hollow King's, but it wasn't the suffocating, oppressive drone they'd come to expect. This was articulate, almost amused. You've been so busy silencing, haven't you? So focused on the symptom, you've completely missed the disease. The voice continued, laced with a disconcerting intelligence. You see, I don't need sound. I need the potential for it. The hunger for silence is far more potent, far more nourishing. Morian, or rather, the lingering echo of his influence within the cathedral's resonance, was still partially active, a corrupted puppet dancing to the Hollow King's tune. He attempted to rally the remaining muted operatives, a handful of disgraced Orcish shamans and elven sorcerers, to launch a counterattack, but his efforts were weakened by the overwhelming force of the restored sound. Holler, anticipating this, unleashed a wave of dissonant notes, a jagged, chaotic surge designed to disrupt the Hollow King's connection to Moria. It was a brutal, visceral attack, focused on tearing apart the corrupted frequencies. Sever the link! Holler roared, her bell ringing with a desperate fury. Break the conduit! But The Hollow King was already anticipating her move. A torrent of gray viscous energy coalesced around Morian's shattered remains, solidifying into a shimmering, almost translucent form. The Hollow King, no longer a mere parasite, had begun to manifest, taking a crude, vaguely humanoid shape composed entirely of silence. It resembled a skeletal figure draped in shadows, with eyes that burned with a cold, vacant light. Such impressive displays of futile defiance, the Hollow King's voice echoed, amplified by the very silence it commanded. You fight to preserve a world that is already gone. You fight to feel, when feeling is a disease. You misunderstand the beauty of the void. As the Hollow King reached out a hand made of nothing but absence, a wave of chilling silence pulsed outwards, threatening to extinguish the restored resonance, to plunge the cathedral back into the suffocating embrace of the void. Grok, driven by primal instinct, slammed his drum against the stone floor with a force that threatened to shatter the ancient instrument. A wave of sonic energy erupted, not targeted at the Hollow King, but at the very foundations of the cathedral, a desperate attempt to ground the chaos, to anchor the restored sound to something real. Elara, seizing the opportunity, began to play a new song on her harp, a song not of beauty or harmony, but of raw, untamed fury, a cascade of discordant notes designed to overload the Hollow King's senses. The song was a prayer, a battle cry, a desperate plea to the forgotten gods of sound. Chapter 11. The Coop of the Crescendo. The air, in the great resonance cathedral, hung thick with a desperate tension, a palpable vibration of fear and exertion. Grok's drumming continued, a relentless, bone-jarring rhythm that seemed to physically shake the very stones, while Elara's harp wept a torrent of dissonant chords. The Hollow King, a terrifying monument to nothingness, watched with a chilling detachment, its vacant eyes reflecting the struggle like pools of frozen starlight. You mistake resistance for understanding, it rasped, its voice a chilling whisper that seemed to vibrate within the listener's skull. You cling to the echoes of a world consumed, believing they offer solace. The void is not an enemy to be fought, but an absence to be embraced. The remaining members of the Stormgard Guard, led by the grizzled captain Lyra Stonehand, were a ragged, exhausted line, their movements hesitant, their faces itched with the horror of witnessing their own generals marching headlong into oblivion. The Frost-Wolf Orcs, under the stoic command of Chieftain Buruk Stoneheart, mirrored their frustration, the thunderous beat of their war drums a futile attempt to stem the tide of encroaching silence. The Spire-Elves, led by the ethereal Archon Lyrian Moonweave, their faces masks of serene concentration, maintained a protective barrier with shimmering wards, struggling against the void's creeping influence. The muted clustered around the fallen figures of Bishop Morian and Chieftain Vorlag, radiated a disturbing calm. Their silver void tongues, now polished to a disturbing sheen, pulsed with a faint, unsettling light. They didn't flinch as Grok's drum shattered the cathedral floor, didn't recoil from Elara's furious song. Instead, they simply tilted their heads, absorbing the chaos, their expressions devoid of any emotion beyond a strange, unnerving comprehension. Suddenly, a high-pitched, piercing note ripped through the cacophony, a single, perfectly sustained chime struck by Master Silas, a human bell ringer who had joined the resistance after discovering the muted were using enchanted bells to draw Stormgard soldiers into the silent zones. Silas, a man built like a blacksmith and blessed with a voice that could shatter granite, moved with surprising agility, dodging the tendrils of the Hollow King's silence. "The silver is a conduit," he shouted, his voice amplified by the resonance of the cathedral. "It's amplifying his will." He focused his energy, channeling the harmonic resonance of the bell through his entire being. As he struck again, the note resonated with an almost unbearable intensity. A wave of pure, concentrated sound erupted from the bell, directly targeting the void silver tongues of Bishop Morian. The silver shattered with the sound of 1,000 collapsing stars. The bishop's body convulsed violently, and then, with a final silent scream, a scream unheard, yet felt with visceral intensity, he simply dissolved, leaving behind only a faint shimmer of gray dust. The effect was immediate. The other bishops, seeing their counterparts destroyed, reacted instinctively, but it was too late. Grok, fueled by an instinctive understanding, unleashed a furious barrage of rhythmic pounding upon his own war drum, mimicking the desperate, chaotic pulse of the cathedral itself. The vibrations intensified, growing into a tangible force, a raw physical assault. The void silver tongues of Chieftain Vorlag, shimmering with stolen sound, began to vibrate uncontrollably, the unnatural resonance shattering the bone and flesh. He collapsed into a heap of dust, accompanied by a brief agonizing scream that only Grok and Silas could perceive. "The rhythm is the key!" Grok roared, his voice thick with exertion. "It's not about destroying the void, but reshaping it." Elara, sensing the shift in momentum, abandoned her initial attack. The raw fury of her song had been a desperate gamble, a plea for assistance. Now, she focused on a different approach, a technique passed down through generations of Spire-Elves, the art of sonic weaving. Her harp strings resonated with a complex, layered melody, a sequence of tones meticulously crafted to disrupt the very structure of the Hollow King's silence. It wasn't a song of beauty, but a weapon of pure sonic dissonance, a cascade of fractured harmonies designed to overload the void's fragile frequency. As the final notes of her song of unmaking cascaded through the cathedral, the void silver tongues of the remaining muted began to vibrate violently, their voices dissolving into a blinding sonic wave that washed over the skeletal form of the Hollow King. The Hollow King shrieked, a silent shriek, a disruption of the void itself, and began to unravel. Its form flickered, fragmented, its eyes burning with an intensified, agonizing light. It was as if the very essence of nothingness was being forced to confront itself, overwhelmed by the sudden, overwhelming influx of sound. Now this cannot be. The Hollow King's voice, now a fractured echo, reached a fever pitch. The music, it burns. Then, with a final shuddering collapse, the Hollow King vanished, leaving behind only a swirling vortex of gray dust and a profound, breathtaking silence, a silence filled with the promise of sound. Chapter 12. The Shattered Resonance. The vortex of dust settled with agonizing slowness, revealing the ravaged grandeur of the great Resonance Cathedral. The skeletal remains of the Hollow King lay within, not a triumphant conquest, but a monument to a horrifying misunderstanding. The air still shimmered with residual dissonance, a ghost of the void's presence, but it was quickly being overwhelmed by something far more vibrant, the tentative chirping of displaced birds, the distant rush of a recovered stream, and, unbelievably, the ragged breathing of Elara, Kalen, and Riss. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic ballet of relief and disorientation. Stormgard soldiers, momentarily stunned by the sheer sonic force unleashed, scrambled for their weapons, their war cries choked into unintelligible grunts. The Frost-Wolf Orcs, still reeling from the earth-shattering rhythm of Kalen's drumming, cautiously circled the site, their tusks gleaming with primal confusion. Elara, exhausted but strangely invigorated, knelt beside the remnants of the Hollow King, her hands trembling as she plucked a single clear note from her harp. It worked," she whispered, her voice raw, a sound she hadn't consciously made in what felt like an eternity. The chaos, the dissonancy broke him. Kalen, his face stained with sweat and dust, lowered his war drum, the vibrations still faintly pulsing through his muscles. The chieftains, they were instruments of annihilation. We weaponized their corruption. He surveyed the carnage with a grim satisfaction, a stark contrast to the bewildered faces of his warriors. A brutal, necessary elegance. Rhys, ever the pragmatist, was already assessing the damage. The void silver. It's gone. Completely shattered. But the cathedral's irrevocably altered. The magic here is unstable. We need to understand how this song of unmaking works, and how to control it. He turned his attention to the few surviving members of the Spire-Elven Guard, who were carefully examining the intricate carvings on the cathedral walls, symbols of sound and silence, now overlaid with fractured harmonies. As they spoke, a ripple of unease spread through the assembled forces. The silence, once a tool of the Hollow King, was now a palpable force in itself, a lingering echo of the void's hunger. Several Stormguard soldiers began to clutch their ears, their faces contorted in pain. Kalen noticed the subtle tremor in the ground, a faint vibration that resonated deep within his bones, a warning. "The resonance is shifting," he rumbled, his voice laced with caution. "The void is attempting to reassert itself, seeking to fill the gaps in our restored sound." Suddenly, a piercing shriek echoed through the cathedral, not the silent scream of the Hollow King, but a raw, agonizing wail. A young Stormguard soldier, a recent recruit barely out of his teens, collapsed to the ground, clutching his head, his eyes wide with terror. Around him, others began to exhibit similar symptoms: disorientation, nausea, and a horrifying sense of emptiness. The mute's influence, Alara realized, her face paling. There are telepathic echoes there, still reaching, seeking to undermine our progress. They're trying to infect us with silence. It was Rhys who acted swiftly. He pulled a small, intricately carved bone flute from his pack, a relic passed down through his family for generations. He began to play, not a battle cry or a war song, but a series of low, resonant tones, a counter-resonance designed to disrupt the void's intrusive signals. The sound was strangely soothing, a grounding force in the midst of chaos. "We must create a shield of sound," he declared, his voice gaining strength. Not a wall, but a flowing current, constantly adjusting to the void's attempts to penetrate. As Rhys played, Alara and Kalen joined him, weaving their respective instruments into the sonic tapestry. Alara's harp added layers of intricate harmonies, while Kalen's drum provided a steady, pulsing rhythm, a heartbeat of defiance against the encroaching silence. The cathedral seemed to respond, the fractured harmonies coalescing, the air vibrating with a renewed intensity. But the effect was fleeting. The soldier's agony intensified, and a figure materialized within the swirling dust, a young elf, his eyes vacant, his face contorted in a silent scream. He raised a hand, and a thin silver blade shimmered into existence, aimed directly at Rhys. "The muted are evolving," Kalen shouted, drawing his axe and charging forward. "They're learning to weaponize our strength against us." The battle for the restored resonance had begun anew, not against a monstrous king, but against the insidious whispers of a corrupted mind, a testament to the enduring power of silence and the desperate need to hear. Chapter 13. The Fracture of Silence. The air in the Great Resonance Cathedral hung thick with the scent of ozone and something acrid, like burnt bone. The dust motes, once frozen in a gray stillness, now danced with erratic, shimmering particles, a chaotic byproduct of the unleashed magic. Rhys continued to play, his fingers moving with a frantic urgency, the ancient drum vibrating with a force that threatened to shake the very foundations of the cathedral. The low tones hadn't diminished but had intensified, pushing back against the oppressive weight of the void's influence. Kalen, his face grim and streaked with sweat, moved like a whirlwind, his axe a silver blur, intercepting the silent attacks of the muted. The young elf, the one who'd materialized with the silver blade, was gone, swallowed back into the swirling chaos. But Head demonstrated a chilling evolution. The muted weren't simply passively following orders, they were actively adapting, learning to anticipate and counter their effort. Elara, her movements fluid and precise, wove a complex tapestry of sound with her harp. The harmonies she created felt less like melody and more like a surgical dissection of the void's frequency, each note a precise cut designed to weaken the connection between the corrupted leaders and the Hollow King. She noticed a subtle shift in the air, a thinning of the oppressive silence, a feeling like a membrane was slowly peeling away. "The resonance is building," she shouted, her voice strained but filled with a rare note of triumph. "The vibrations are coalescing, pushing back against the hunger." But the victory was short-lived. As Reese intensified the drum's rhythm, a horrifying clarity began to dawn on him. The muted weren't just passively absorbing sound, they were actively filtering it, mimicking the chaotic pulse of the void within their silvered mouths. It was as if they were attempting to build a false resonance, a corrupted imitation of the natural order. Suddenly, the cathedral's colossal stained-glass windows, depicting scenes of ancient harmonies and the birth of sound, began to crack. Thin, silver fissures spread across the glass, radiating outwards in silent waves. From within these fractures, figures began to emerge, not fully formed, but shimmering projections of the muted leaders, each one a grotesque parody of their former selves. Bishop Morian, his void silver tongue replaced with a jagged crystalline extension, began to recite a monotone litany, a twisted hymn to the Hollow King. Chieftain Baruch, his face a mask of chilling serenity, beat a rhythmic tattoo on a spectral war drum, a vibration that felt not of the earth, but of an alien, uncaring space. And Ilara's former advisor, Lyrian, a master of elven song, produced a haunting, dissonant chord, a deliberate disruption of the healing harmony. "They're feeding the void," Reese roared, his voice raw with urgency. "They're not just communicating, they're amplifying it." Kalen, caught between the shifting projections, deflected a blast of sonic energy that would have shattered his skull. He swung his axe with brutal force, cleaving through the projection of Baruch, but it simply reformed, the rhythmic drumming continuing unaffected. "The silver isn't just a conduit," Kalen yelled, "it's a lens. They're focusing the void's power." Elara realized the horrifying truth. The coup of the crescendo wasn't about simply destroying the muted leaders, it was about disrupting the very process of resonance. They weren't battling an enemy, but a paradox, a corrupted echo attempting to become whole. "Reese, you need to break the rhythm," she screamed, her fingers dancing across the strings of her harp. "You need to introduce chaos to disrupt their imitation." Reese, understanding the shift, abandoned the steady grounding pulse of the drum. He began to introduce variations, a frantic stutter, a jarring accent, a series of rapid irregular beats that seemed to assault the senses. The projections of the muted leaders flickered, momentarily unstable, their synchronized movements disrupted. The silver fissures in the windows widened, spewing forth a torrent of discordant energy. But the Hollow King, sensing the disruption, responded with terrifying force. A wave of absolute silence descended, a suffocating blanket that threatened to crush the remaining sound. The air thickened, pressing down on them, and Reese felt a cold dread creep into his bones. The void was not just silencing them, it was trying to erase them entirely. Just as he thought all hope was lost, a strange, almost painful clarity washed over him. He realized the key wasn't chaos, but precision. Not disruption, but harmonization. He shifted the drum's rhythm once more, but this time, he wasn't fighting the void. He was mirroring it, subtly, almost imperceptibly, weaving a new resonance, a countercurrent of sound designed to absorb and neutralize the corrupted frequency. As he did, the projections of the muted leaders began to collapse, not with destruction, but with a shimmering dissolution, returning to the chaotic nothingness from whence they came. Chapter 14. The Echo of Absence. The silence in the great resonance cathedral was no longer simply empty, it was active. A dense, viscous thing that clung to the stone and choked the very air. Rhys felt it not just in his ears, but in his bones. A deep, resonant ache of loss. The silver fissures in the cathedral's colossal windows, once hairline cracks, now pulsed with a gray luminescence, mirroring the vacant eyes of the muted leaders, frozen in their final horrifying poses. Bishop Morian, the human traitor, was slumped against the altar, his void silver tongue a jagged black ruin, while Chieftain Grook, the Orcish Drum-Slayer, lay splayed on the floor, his war drums scattered around him, their once potent rhythm silenced forever. Elara, the Elven Harp-Strider, remained motionless, her harp frozen mid-strum, a single perfect note hanging in the oppressive stillness. "It's beautifully awful," muttered Bram, the human bell-ringer, his face pale but resolute. He adjusted the intricate chime head been meticulously crafting, a smaller, more delicate instrument designed to amplify and manipulate sound. "The king is learning. He has adapted to our attempts to disrupt him." Rhys, sweat slicking his forehead, ignored him, focusing on the unsettlingly rhythmic thrumming within his own chest. He continued to modulate the drum, a frantic dance between chaos and control. The earlier, jarring rhythms had merely provoked a more forceful reaction from the Hollow King, a wave of absolute silence that threatened to unravel their minds. But this new approach, this mirroring of the void's unsettling pulse, felt correct. It wasn't about brute force, he realized, but about a delicate, almost obsessive attention to the rhythm of annihilation. "The projections are weakening," Elara announced, her voice barely a whisper, strained against the suffocating silence. "The frequency shifts." As anticipating our moves, feeding off our attempts to counteract him. Her fingers moved instinctively, running over the strings of her harp, seeking the precise pitch that would break the king's hold. Suddenly, a flicker of movement. Bishop Morian's remaining eye, a dull, gray orb, snapped open, focusing on Rhys with unnerving intensity. A telepathic tremor, cold and brittle, invaded his mind, a fragmented command, a desperate plea for coherence. "Revert! Restore the pattern! The chorus is failing!" Rhys didn't flinch. Instead, he amplified his rhythmic counterpoint, deepening the resonance, drawing the corrupted frequency into himself. He felt the king's assault, a pressure building behind his eyes, a sensation of being unraveled, his very self threatened by the encroaching void. He imagined the sound, not as a weapon, but as a net, carefully crafted to contain the chaos. "Bram, the chimes!" Rhys shouted, his voice a strained rasp. "Now!" Bram reacted instantly. He unleashed the chimes, a cascade of perfectly tuned frequencies, each note a precise, agonizingly beautiful disruption to the bishop's corrupted thought pattern. The silver fissures in the windows widened further, spewing forth a torrent of discordant energy that slammed into Morian, not as an attack, but as a surgical intervention. The bishop convulsed, his body twisting in an impossible spasm as the holy sound tore at the void silver within him. But the Hollow King didn't falter. The silence thickened, pressing down on them with unbearable weight. It wasn't a simple negation of sound, it was an absorption of it, a consuming hunger. Just as Rhys felt his own resonance threatened, a memory surfaced, a fragment of an ancient elven ballad, a tale of a mountain stream that defied the silence, a stream that thrived by echoing the emptiness of the surrounding valley. He's not just stealing sound, Rhys realized, a sudden comprehension flooding his mind. He is feeding on it. He needs the dissonance, the contradiction, to sustain himself. He shifted the drum's rhythm again, this time not mirroring the king's pulse, but layering it with a deliberate, almost unbearable harmony. He played a sequence of notes deep, resonant tones punctuated by sharp, jarring accents not to disrupt, but to overwhelm, to drown the king's corrupted frequency in a torrent of balanced, restorative sound. The projections of the muted leaders shimmered, their forms dissolving, not with a violent explosion, but with a gentle, melancholic fading. The silver fissures in the windows began to close, the gray luminescence receded. Grook, the Orcish Drum-Slayer, stirred slightly, a low groan escaping his lips. His eyes, once glazed with the void silver's influence, flickered with a nascent spark of awareness. Finally, with a resounding crack that echoed through the cathedral, the Hollow King shattered. It wasn't a single dramatic moment of destruction, but a gradual, agonizing collapse, like a star fading into nothingness. As the last vestiges of the king's presence dissipated, the silence began to shift. It wasn't the absolute void they'd known, but a thin, expectant stillness, pregnant with possibility. Then, a single, tentative note. A cricket, hidden within the cathedral's ancient stonework, chirped, and then another, and another, until a chorus of tiny sounds filled the air, the rustle of cloth, the creak of stone, the very hum of their own breathing. The echo wells, dormant for centuries, began to thrum with renewed energy, releasing a wave of pure, vibrant sound. The War of the Stillness, it seemed, was over. Chapter 15. The Echo of Awakening, the Great Resonance Cathedral, pulsed. Not with the sickly gray luminescence of the Hollow King's influence, but with a nascent, hesitant light. The air, thick with the absence of sound for decades, now shimmered with the promise of returning music. Grook, the Orcish Drum-Slayer, lay on the cold flagstones, his muscles still protesting the unnerving shift within him. The void silver implants, once cold and alien, were gone, leaving behind a dull ache and a bewildering awareness of the tremor in his bones, a rhythm not dictated by the Hollow King, but by the very earth beneath Stormgard. He stirred, pushing himself upright with a grunt, the movement jerky and unfamiliar. He looked at the human bell ringer, Kalen, who was meticulously adjusting the intricate brass mechanism of a colossal bell salvaged from a forgotten temple. Kalen, a young man hardened by the bleak realities of the War of the Stillness, still wore the haunted look of someone wrestling with a nightmare, but now a flicker of hope danced in his gray eyes. It's working, he breathed, his voice roughened with disuse, yet undeniably present. The chimes, they resonated with the last of the silver. It wasn't destruction, Grook, it was release. Across the cathedral, Ilara, the Elven Harp-Strider, was painstakingly restoring one of the ancient resonance harps, its strings blackened with the residue of the void silver. Her movements were graceful, precise, steeped in the ancient songs of her people, songs lost to the silence for so long. She glanced at them, her silver eyes reflecting the returning light. The Song of Unmaking It was a brutal beauty, wasn't it? To weave the corruption into something so potent, so alive. The air, thick with the rising sound, was palpable. The initial chaos of the coup of the crescendo was fading, replaced by a cautious, almost reverent atmosphere. The trapped, fragmented echoes of 1,000 voices, a million memories, were beginning to coalesce, forming a tentative symphony. Suddenly, a wave of disorientation washed over them. The sudden influx of sensation, the sheer volume of returning sound was overwhelming. Kalen stumbled, clutching his head. It's too much. The echoes there fighting for dominance, vying for recognition. Ilara stepped forward, her fingers instinctively moving to the strings of the harp. She began to play, not a grand heroic piece, but a simple grounding melody, a lament for the lost sounds, a prayer for balance. The notes, clear and pure, seemed to soothe the cacophony, creating a small pocket of calm within the burgeoning soundscape. The resonance seats not just sound, she explained, her voice quiet but firm. It's memory, emotion, intent. The Hollow King fed on the silence, amplifying the negative emotions, fear, suspicion, hatred. Now we must learn to channel this energy, to shape it, to guide it. As she played, A group of Stormgard orcs, led by Borak, the grizzled chieftain, who had reluctantly accepted Kaelin and Alara's alliance, cautiously entered the cathedral. Borak, a veteran of countless battles against the elven Spire-Elves, regarded them with a wary eye. He had witnessed the horrifying spectacle of his own men, his own warriors, marching into silence, puppets of an unseen force. "What is this?" he rumbled, his voice a low growl, still retaining a lingering echo of the Void Silver's influence. "The king is gone? And the silence, it's gone too?" Kaelin stepped forward, extending a hand in a gesture of peace. "The king is gone, Borak, and with him, the silence." We channeled the corrupted energy through the traitors, and their voices, amplified by the resonance, shattered the hollow king's hull. Borak considered this, his massive frame radiating a palpable skepticism. Then he slowly, deliberately, brought his war drum to his chest. He raised his hands, his eyes closed, and began to beat out a rhythm. It wasn't the frenetic, warlike drumming he was known for, but a slow, measured beat, a primal pulse mirroring the heartbeat of the earth. As he played, a ripple of energy flowed through the cathedral, strengthening the returning soundscape. The cricket, the tiny harbinger of restoration, chirped again, louder this time, joined by the murmur of the wind through the ancient stonework, the drip of water from a distant spring. Then a voice. Not a telepathic command, but a clear, distinct voice emanating from the lips of one of the former muted captains, now slumped unconscious against a pillar. "Water!" the captain croaked, his voice raspy and unused. "Please, water!" A nearby Stormguard healer rushed forward, offering him a goblet of water. As he drank, a single tearful sob escaped him. It was a sound filled with regret, with shame, with the overwhelming relief of being restored to himself. In that moment, standing within the newly awakened heart of the great Resonance Cathedral, Kaelin, Grook, and Alara knew that the War of the Stillness wasn't just over. It was the beginning of something far more profound, a true alliance, built not on conquest and fear, but on the shared experience of listening, of remembering, and of finally hearing each other again.